Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Blatz, the president of UX Research and Strategy, and this is a special revisit from an event that we had in May. We had Amy Santee on, and she was talking about The topic was carrying and candid live feedback session on UX research resumes. We had so many good questions that we didn't get to in the event itself that we thought we would do a follow up session with Amy so that she can answer some of the questions that we did not get an opportunity to get through. So, Amy, for those who didn't have the opportunity to attend the first event, tell everyone who you are.
So I'm Amy Santee. My pronouns are she, her. I live in Portland, Oregon. And I am a career strategist and coach for user experience professionals. So I was actually a UX researcher for roughly 10 years, moving from academia, from anthropology specifically, into doing all kinds of UX and design research for any and all industries, large corporations, startups, small businesses, medium, you name it. Worked in sectors like healthcare, automotive, even some work for the city of Portland in civic design. And I actually moved into being a career coach in March of 2020 after starting to ramp down my research consulting practice. I have always been interested in career development. I've had to go through all of the things that other people are going through today, 10, 12 years later. And it's something that I really enjoy, helping people strategize about their job search, right? Instead of just kind of flailing about and not knowing where to focus, how to prioritize, getting professional materials in place, including resumes, cover letters, portfolios, websites, presentations, you name it. So a lot of tactical type work, but also again, that overall strategy of, how do I get this job that I'm looking for in a timely and effective manner. So that's a big part of my work. I also work with folks who are already in jobs and they're navigating different types of professional development questions and decisions, things that are going on at work, people needing a sounding board. And but primarily my clients fall into the job search category. And mostly I work with UX researchers, but also a lot of people coming into UX research from academia, from other types of roles and industries like social work or education, that sort of thing. And then I also work with folks who have, been in the field for a while and who are just, looking for their next opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy, for that summary. I really appreciate that. I also wanted to point out that we have Nicole on here. And Nicole is the UX Research and Strategy Events Director. She is the one who makes all the magic happen behind the scenes and plans all our events. And she's going to help me shoot all these fantastic questions at Amy today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started, Amy. And I want to talk about, first thing is, one thing that really stuck with me in our initial discussion, and I think you visited it in the event itself, was that objective or that summary statement at the beginning of a resume. Can you tell us a little bit about, revisit what you said is an opportunity for a person to take on their resume with that?
Yeah, I like to think of a summary, a professional summary statement, whatever, don't call it objective. That's like old school language, but it's like a kind of a pitch, a summary about who you are and what drives you and what you're interested in, expertise, that sort of thing. I like to see it as a way to set context for your resume. So you can have a resume and you just kind of start with, your jobs, you lay out your responsibilities and outcomes and whatever you did at that role. You have a skill section, and that's fine. Sometimes that can be self-explanatory, and that can work. But I find that if you add something to set context before someone starts to look at the details of your resume, they can just get that understanding of you as a person and a professional. And you don't want to say results driven, curious, and empathetic user researcher, focused in qualitative and quantitative, whatever, degree in X. Anyone could say that same exact thing, right? So there are things that you kind of want to avoid that are cliche or vacuous, that don't really say anything about yourself. And also we can kind of make assumptions that researchers fit all of those, that those words are applicable to all researchers. So it doesn't mean like don't mention your areas of expertise. There are certain things you can kind of pull out of the details and synthesize into that summary. So for example, if I were going to apply for some kind of job in a company, maybe doing similar work that I do to what I do right now. So maybe coaching folks on a design team, perhaps working with the team on the onboarding process, working in a design ops kind of role. If I were going to apply and put a resume together, I might talk about in that summary up top, I might talk about how I'm currently practicing as a career strategist and coach. I will mention like very succinctly what the goal of my work is. I would also mention that I have a ton of experience in UX. So that could set me apart from someone who, say, is a coach or focuses on professional development, but comes from an HR background, right? So like that experience I have, just pointing that out right away would set me apart from this other person. Perhaps it's something about my background as an anthropologist. I work with folks who are going into research and they come from market research, or maybe they come from advertising or whatever, and they have these research skills. But what sets them apart from others is, they have worked in advertising for 5 years, maybe not doing research, but let's say they're going to apply to Google on the ads team, or something like in the domain that they used to be in, right? So like calling that kind of stuff out. Or let's say you're a researcher and you have a degree or work experience as an engineer. That could help you stand out from the crowd of folks who are, say, applying at highly technical product companies like GitHub or software developer tools, right? So it's identifying what really makes you special and kind of wrapping it up into something that gives that person a quick understanding and then an easier and a more clarity when they're actually looking at the details of the document.
Okay, so how do you balance that uniqueness without like being too unique and too maybe weird? I don't know. Like, how do you pinpoint the items that really make you stand out?
It just has to be relevant. That's it. If you take a first stab at it, you have a draft and you step back and go, anyone else could say the same thing. You might want to get rid of a lot of that stuff. You might keep some things like qual and quant, evaluative, exploratory research, some keywords that someone might want to know immediately about you. And yes, it could show up in your skills or it could surface in your job descriptions. But I think that is okay to call out, even though a lot of people could say the same thing. Look for the things that other folks cannot say, again, about your background, your particular area of expertise. Is the content relevant to that person? Does it set context? And is it too redundant to what's in the details of the doc?
Any advice you have for tailoring a resume to a specific job description?
Yeah. First of all, you want to know the exact kind of role you want to apply for. And what I mean by that is you might be interested in research, you might be interested in product management, design. You have to get really clear on narrowing to the exact one kind of role you want to apply for. Because if you don't, you're going to have to make two of everything. You're going to have to do twice as much work. You're not going to be clear on your story and how to communicate that in any of your materials. So that's the first step. The second step is to start to create like a foundation for your resume. And what I mean is you don't need a lot of resume versions. right? You want to have a core resume, and you might make some simple tweaks here and there depending on the role. So let's say you're a UX researcher, you've had a job in, some kind of research job in healthcare for a couple of years, and you have a couple of jobs you're looking at. One is to work on, some kind of software for accountants. And then another one is another job in another kind of healthcare company. You might make some changes to your resume to emphasize the healthcare experience you have to that particular company. And that would obviously make the most sense. For this other one or any other kind of role, it's fine if you don't have experience in that particular industry, but there might be something you change about it to say emphasize working on a similar type of platform like mobile apps, right? Like highlight that kind of stuff. Ultimately, no, you don't really need to have many significantly different versions. The one other thing I would say is to make sure that your resume matches up with the job description as much as possible. What kind of skills they're looking for, types of experience, anything that is a qualification, highlight that and address it in your resume.
So, thinking about self-assessing whether you're an expert or not, or how much of an expert you are on something, how do you speak to that on your resume?
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting question. When we apply for jobs, we're going for a particular like level that has requirements for some years of experience, 2 years, 5 years. And that's not always a correlation to like expertise in everything, every kind of method or approach to research or whatever. So I think that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is like, okay, can I claim this skill on my resume? Well, have you done it enough times to feel confident that the next time you do it, you'll do a good job? I feel like that's it, right? If you're coming from another field, or let's say you're coming from academia and you've done, a lot of interviews, so you can claim you know how to do qualitative interviews, but if you get into the room with someone, or if you get into an interview and they're asking you more about that, do you feel good about being able to speak to that skill you have using UX language, right? So like there's just ways to kind of account for how you communicate the level or expertise of skills that you have in this particular field. Another way I think about it is if you feel like you could do a really good job of teaching someone else how to do this particular thing, usability tests, for example, that's also a good indicator. The important thing is the due diligence of knowing that that is actually true. And because you've done it a lot, because your work has been effective, because you have done enough self-directed learning to kind of pinpoint where you're at in terms of the like how qualified you are with this particular thing. And I think that's especially important for folks who are new to UX research. If we don't take the time to learn about the field and what this job actually entails, how do we know how to speak to our skill set in relation to this work? Darren Hood, who's a great person to follow on LinkedIn, he talks about, what is it, the Dunning-Kruger effect or something like that, right? So Dunning-Kruger, and I'm going to Google it, Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology, a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given intellectual or social domain greatly overestimate their own knowledge or competence in that domain relative to objective criteria or to the performance of their peers or of people in general. And I think that's a really great concept here, right? Like, I think some folks, on occasion, I'll see people who have maybe done some kind of training or who have practiced research to some extent or whatever, And they might believe that they're more qualified than they are because they don't actually know about the bigger picture of how to apply that skill. Or, UX research, it goes beyond usability and one-on-one interviews. There's a lot more to it, right? So like you have to know where you fit into the system. You have to really be able to compare what you're able to do, again, to how this is described here, objective criteria, right? So what is the community saying, generally speaking, is what is required to say you're competent at something, or as it compares with the performance of the other people who work in this field.
Yeah, that's a great cognitive bias for sure that I have seen firsthand.
Yes.
And that's actually perfect because you kind of are already started to touch on this, but leads to our next question, which is how much experience doing research as a researcher is good enough for you to find a job as a UX researcher?
Are you talking about like new entrants into the field?
Yeah, so I guess to be a little more specific, like are there any sort of standards in terms of length of working in the field, and then how that then translates to what job role or level you're going to be applying for?
I mean, it goes back to this idea of like, you need 5 years of experience. Like that doesn't, you have to dig further into what they mean by that. And that also requires companies to be more precise in what they're asking for on a job description. So 5 years of experience, does it have to be 5 years of experience doing UX research on product teams in, companies that make products? Can your academic research count towards that? And I'm 100% believer in yes, that it does. Like it really bugs me when people say, oh, you have a PhD, you've done research for like 5 or 7 years to get that, but it doesn't count towards the requirements. Like that just doesn't even make sense, right? Those can be the best. Those folks are often the best researchers because they have such a solid background in designing rigorous studies and understanding complex spaces, right? And it doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of stuff to learn, again, with regard to learning about this world of UX. But anyway, to go back to your question, I think we have to look at the specifics of the job description, and really evaluate like, okay, where do I feel like I fall with these things? And you might start to notice, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm looking for a early career level, or I'm looking for a mid-level or a senior level, right? And you'll notice patterns across job descriptions and what they're looking for, but there's going to be variation. So you also have to pay attention to how different companies and teams are even defining what a senior level person does, or an intern. How is an intern different from a junior? Like that variation is something to factor in, and it definitely makes things challenging. So, there are some tools out there, some self-assessment type tools on, I don't know, if you remind me, I can share the links and you can add them to your page. But some people have made some open source self-assessments for research skills, and they use some really good kind of, I don't know, it's just like, here's the skill and you can rate yourself kind of like ballpark where you think you fall, and it can kind of help you identify like, yeah, you're leaning more towards senior in general, you are highly expert in these things but not in these things. And that's the thing, right? Like not all researchers are experts in every single methodology or every single type of approach to research. So it's not just like you fall into this one bucket. There's a lot of nuances. And always apply for a job if you feel like you meet most of the criteria. Job descriptions are written to identify, here's like the perfect person that we're looking for. And they might find that person. They might find someone who doesn't meet a lot of the criteria, but who has domain expertise they're bringing, right? So there's different ways of thinking about fit and qualifications. And it's important to apply if you feel like overall it's a pretty good fit.
Awesome. And then aside from the self-assessment tools, which we'll link to, is there any other tips that you have for kind of figuring out like which level you fall under?
If you're in a company right now, ideally the team or the manager has defined like career ladders that you can look at and go, okay, like what else do I need to do in order to get a promotion, right? Or like what's the difference between me and some other folks on the team, and what does that mean for my job, right? So actually looking at frameworks like that in the company you're in. There are also some open source frameworks out there. I can also provide the links to that, but some places don't have ladders. Some places you might be the only researcher or two, and you have, your title is whatever. And I see that a lot with clients who they're the only researcher, or they don't have much support from their manager. They don't work with other researchers, and therefore it's hard for them to compare themselves to their peers, going back to this idea of or the importance of being able to determine how you compare with other folks in the field. And some people don't have that, and that makes it more challenging for them to also know like what kind of jobs should I apply to, or what levels to apply to. So these are just some things to consider. And as researchers, we know the importance of looking at enough data and enough information out there to know that we are paying attention to the right things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have seen that in companies. So are you suggesting, Amy, that's kind of a place to start, whatever the job level write-ups are in the company you are might give you a starting point as far as other companies and how they assess those levels.
And yeah, it's like, okay, I know I want to apply, I want to look for a new job. Okay, here's kind of like my hypothesis as to where I'll fit in. Is it mid, senior, lead, principal, staff, whatever? Is it L1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Like only certain companies use those level things. In fact, I've never worked in a company that uses levels like that. And so you have to kind of figure out which things correspond, right? So there's that variation. But once you kind of determine that, just go look at 10 job descriptions that are relevant to you, that are of interest, and look for those patterns across jobs. And you'll see some like outlier things, you'll see some specific stuff, but doing that will give you a general sense for, okay, now I can narrow my job search down to a particular level, knowing also that levels are called different things in different companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. I once had a mentor tell me that a job description is like a Santa's wish list. You write down all the things that you want for Christmas, but you're only going to get some of them. So just approach that with the mindset that they might want all of these things, but very rarely does a person have top-notch skills in all of the 20 requirements they write out.
Yeah, or maybe you have something that they didn't realize they would value,
Yeah, I've definitely seen that too. Friends who have been in an interview, they brought this research skill set, and they were like, "Whoa, we were just looking for a designer, but research sounds really good." So she got the job because she had a good base of research, and they were like, "Wow, this is really cool."
Or the opposite. Let's say you're a researcher and you know just enough about how to use Figma for prototypes, paper prototyping, or mock-ups or low fidelity or whatever, and maybe you don't know the interaction design stuff, but that could be very beneficial in working with designers, just to even know what that process is like. Or hey, let me mock something up real quick based on like what I'm learning in the research, and then talk about it with the designer or whatever. So that's another example of how that might work.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to switch gears a little bit, Amy, and talk about balancing that UX work, like versus not having a lot of experience, right? Or some of those side projects versus their professional experiences, right? So, how do you balance or discuss volunteer, side projects, passion projects that are work experiences in a sense versus true professional work experiences? How do you lay those out within your resume and talk about those?
Yeah, there's a couple things there. It's like, okay, how do I actually show this on the resume? How do I put in a certain section? How do I like, what's the title? Do I say like I was a volunteer? Do I say, what do I actually say? And then there's deciding what projects you actually want to talk about on your resume, or what work you want to talk about, or in an interview. I think the second one is important to figure out first. So basically, if you've done work as a volunteer, as an intern, as a actual paid person, as an academic in your class, if it is a solid project, then it's great. If it's, and you have to know, is it a solid project? Did you talk to like 3 people and make 10 personas? Like, that's not gonna fly. Did like, is it actually a solidly designed project? Even if you're new, like, did you do the due diligence of knowing, like, here's how I need to make this happen? And so it doesn't matter. Like, that's the most important thing, is if you can show you've done good work and that you can come in and continue to do good work. And that can be really relieving for people who are coming from academia. Maybe they are coming out of their master's program and they went to an HCI program, but they did several projects in their program, and oh, do these count or not? Again, if they're good projects and you can talk about them and showcase what you can do, that's perfectly fine. People just have to have confidence in that, essentially.
I have a follow-up question with you. Just want to make sure. So what I'm hearing you say, I think, is it's okay to include those non-paid perhaps projects in your resume, just cater it down or edit it down to the good ones.
Right. Yeah. If someone inquires with you about this project you mentioned on your resume, like, you need to be able to talk about it as a solid example of your work. I've done plenty of unpaid projects. One of them was a 9-month volunteer project for the city of Portland. And we built a software, we shipped it, it had real world impacts. And why would I not talk about that? Unfortunately, given the competitive nature of getting into UX research, some people have to take on unpaid work in order to practice and put together some projects and case studies. And why should that person be penalized for that, right? If someone cares that it wasn't paid, then like, that doesn't even make sense, and you can just move on from that conversation. The other part of it that you asked about is like, how do you actually show it on your resume? And there's no one correct way, right? Like, typically we see, I had this job, here's the details. I had this job, here's the details. For academics, you can just say like, PhD researcher, graduate researcher, whatever, I did this dissertation, talk about, your responsibilities and outcomes and, the purpose of that project, or whatever. Sometimes I see people who are currently in some kind of training program. So it's not a job. So like Ask Like a Pro, which is Curiosity Tank, Michelle Ronson, it's a really great program. And I know I think she's been a guest in your meetup before. So I've worked with some folks who have done her training, and yeah, it's like over the course of a few months, you do a single project. It's not a job, but you can talk about it essentially in the same way, talking about, again, the responsibilities, what you did, outcomes, how you worked with other stakeholders, whatever it may be. And so I see that as equal to any other kind of experience. It's just a single project. And people can decide how specific they want to be on the resume, calling out the program, saying that you worked with the team, right? Like, I think that's all important context. But you don't have to say like, this was unpaid, you know, like that doesn't matter basically.
I know you kind of just talked about projects, and this is kind of somewhat to piggyback off that. But so, how about listing courses, specific courses that you've taken for human factors or an HCI degree, especially if you're coming from a non-traditional background? Should you keep those on your resume after you've graduated, or what's kind of your advice for that?
If you have an HCI degree and you're applying for roles where people know what that is, you know, people can pretty much assume that you're coming with a relevant background. I don't think it's necessarily necessary to list out like all of the relevant courses that you took. If it's I mean, even with like social science degrees, you know, what you need to communicate is that you are trained in doing quality research and understanding human beings and making sense of complex problem spaces. So thinking about the purpose that any of the content on your resume serves and what it can say about you without you having to like get super specific, I think is a good way to approach it. However, if say you're coming from a totally different field and you have some transferable skills, but you know, have decided to do some training, maybe it was a boot camp, maybe it was, you know, Nielsen Norman training or whatever it might be. I think those are important to call out because it's an indicator that you have been filling your knowledge gaps and you've been like really proactive in getting prepared to come in to do a job, not to mention the value of doing those things to even interview effectively in the first place. So think about like, based on your situation, just think about what does this person need to know about you. And if you aren't just coming from, you know, a UX role into another UX role where that might be an easier process to go through, what assumptions might that person make about you that you want to kind of preemptively dispel? Oh, you're an academic, you know, you studied whatever program. Help them realize that, yes, and I've done all this other stuff. Help them realize like how qualified you are to come in and do this work. And it could be showcasing these training programs, right? And it's also about the language of UX and reflecting that and signaling that in any of the materials that you make.
So you touched on this a little bit about boot camp, and if you're coming from boot camp and how to like include that coursework, let's say, is that something you would put under your experience? You would put that under your education, or like, how do you include that and talk about that on your resume?
Yeah, you know, you can just call it like education and training, or just education. Training is education essentially with an applied component. But yeah, that's the section that I think it would belong in. So, you know, you have a skills section, you might have a tools section, which is, you know, software and that sort of thing. And in an education section, it might be, you know, bachelor's, master's, PhD, whichever one you have. Maybe you don't have any and you're self-taught and you've done some programs, right? Like that's okay too. So I think that would be the most relevant section for it to go in.
Amy, you talked a little bit about academia, and somebody had a good question about journal articles, maybe ones they have published or currently have in progress. What are your thoughts on one, discussing those in the resume, and the relevance that someone might find? Is it relevant to the job or not?
That's the question. That's kind of like one of the main ways you want to decide what to put on your resume at all, is what is relevant to the job and what is relevant to the reader. And academics are very proud of their work. It's hard work. It's important work. The way we measure success and outcomes in academia is typically pretty different than how we think about that in private sector work, in user experience, in a business context, in design context. So when you're in academia, really your goal a lot of the time is to contribute to the knowledge base of the discipline that you're in. And, you know, if it's through research, right, you'll have different types of goals, whether it's like, I want to develop more theory about this particular phenomenon that's out there, answering whatever kind of questions it is that your research is seeking to answer. Sometimes there are like applied outcomes of that, and it could be impacting policy. It could be, there are academics who do work on actual like tangible things as well. But my point is the way we think about success and impact can be different. So in academia, you have like presenting at conferences, publishing articles, writing a book, being promoted to department chair, all of this stuff. And those are really important sort of outcomes and like cultural capital within academia. But yeah, to your point, it's not always relevant in this world that you're going into. However, you can take some of these things and talk about them in a different way so that you're showcasing that it's relevant, right? Like if you taught a bunch of courses that showcases communication skills and planning and designing program courses so that you can help students and the department achieve particular outcomes, right? Like student retention or graduation, or what were your reviews as a professor from the students? Did you help create some new academic program? So like you want to find that kind of stuff to talk about. I think sometimes publications could matter if they are highly relevant to the role you're applying to. So let's say you are master's or PhD in HCI and you've published in some kind of HCI journal. That's going to be a good thing to put on your resume. So what's the relevance of the actual work? Some companies have teams of researchers that are like intentionally all PhDs doing research for the company that also gets kind of like infused back into academia. And so in that case, those sorts of outputs or outcomes would be even more appealing to a team that's looking for that kind of person specifically. So again, what's relevant to the role? What is relevant to the reader? Do they need to know this thing about you now? Yes or no?
Yeah, that's great, Amy. I have a follow-up question. You mentioned something about like when you show some of these things that you've done, and it illustrates like your communication skills, your organization skills. Do you need to point that out, that this kind of additional experience actually did this, and this? Do you feel like you need to point those soft skills out on the resume?
Not really. I think let's assume that people want us to have soft skills, and we should have those skills, know what they are. And those things will come up more in like, how do you actually interact in the interview process? How do you do your presentation? How do you answer behavioral questions? Like, you can get to that stuff. So I don't think it's necessary to be like, I don't even know, what are some soft skills? I don't think it's necessary to put on there. It's more about those technical skills. But there are like other professional skills, right? Like public speaking, which is important in our work. Things like that are not research technical skills specifically. And you might call them out in your skills section. Project management, for example, that could be another one. But you're also looking to communicate this information in how you talk about your work experience, and not stating it, but showing it. So if you're, I don't know, you come from social work and you worked with clients to, improve their family experiences and, help them towards their particular goals. You worked for an organization that had its own program goals. You probably thought a lot about the process of working with your clients and how to design effective programs within your organization, and improve your own interactions and process with people. So like if you can talk about what you did and make it clear the connection between that and why that stuff is relevant to going into a researcher role, that's what you want to go for.
So just to follow up on that, Amy, I love that you said, show your skills rather than state it. How do you do that on a resume when you don't want to write a whole bunch of stuff, or you're trying to be brief as possible?
Mm-hmm. Well, you have your skills section, and that's just like, okay, let me gloss over this list, qualitative interviews, focus groups, usability, eye tracking, project management, public speaking,
Storytelling.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Like, okay, that's good, because it's like, okay, that person has the stuff, especially for a recruiter who may not be as familiar with what researchers do. They're really just looking for keywords and that sort of thing. To show what you know how to do it in your job descriptions, it's two things. It's what did you do and what were you working towards? Like, what was the outcome of that work? So if you conducted research and you were able to impact a product, a business strategy, maybe a process within your organization or on your team, you were able to get more attention to or like build more interest in research as a function within a company. Whatever these things are, like that's showing your skills in action. Like that's really what you want to do, is show the skills in action. And it's helpful to not be so redundant to your skills list. So if you have a list of 15 technical professional skills, you don't need to restate those things in your job descriptions in talking about, here's what I was doing in a nutshell. Like you don't have to repeat, I did this project using XYZ methodologies. Like maybe it's okay, but you have to decide, can you use that space for something else? Can you really just be succinct and summarize at a high level what it is you were doing, what you were seeking to accomplish, what you were working towards, and any actual outcomes of that work, right? So the less redundant you can be, the better, because then you can use that real estate to drive home points, and include information in there that will, work together with that skills list.
Great, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so another question that came up and related to sort of transitioning and coming from academia is, when you are applying for roles and transitioning from academia or another field, should you apply for more senior roles without, even if you don't have explicit product experience?
It's not like yes or no, or you should or shouldn't. It really depends on, there's a number of factors, right? So I work with a lot of PhDs. They just got their PhD. Maybe they got it a couple years ago. They've been doing some teaching, I don't know, whatever. And those folks go straight into senior roles at numerous companies, and they're typically the bigger tech companies. So Google and Meta and JP Morgan, and JP Morgan's not a tech company, but it's a larger company with a larger team and infrastructure and all of that. And there's a correlation between these folks going into these roles and people internally understanding that these folks are very highly qualified to do the work. And we need to double check that they're ready to come in and do the job, even though they probably have some things to learn, right? So, but I also see PhDs go into entry roles, and I don't like that. I don't think it makes sense, but at some companies, that's what they feel more comfortable with, because they kind of like, they might either discount the academic work, or that person maybe just kind of indicates that they should or are a good fit for that level, like a new career. So there's no one exact way that it happens. That's why I think it's important to look for fit. And so if you know that there are companies that they're not turned on by academics. They're looking for folks with a different kind of background or experience. Then, apply at those companies. If you have a PhD, and you can look and see, where are the PhDs going to work? Okay, here's a bunch of companies. Let me focus on those. Whereas if I apply to companies that don't seem open to someone like me, that's just going to be a waste of time. And you kind of have to like figure that out as much as you can, as early in the process as you can. And then I see folks who have a couple years of experience, and they're like at a mid-level role, or they get promoted really quickly in their company, and it's hard to say why. It could be that person's like a badass, and they're really like the years of experience is not as much of a factor as the fact that they're really good at their job. It could be that like that person, it could be that it doesn't actually make sense for that to happen, and that company is like not quite clear on the levels and what's actually needed. I don't know, there's so many factors. So it's really, again, just about like looking at all of this information as data and helping you figuring out what to pay attention to in order to narrow down the companies you're applying for fit, and what is the likelihood that they're going to find you and your background and your skill set of high relevance and interest to the role that they have open.
Thanks for that. So Amy, I have a follow-up. A concern that I've heard quite a bit, especially from people with those advanced degrees in the product world, from the product side of things, is that in tech and in product things, you have to move very quickly. You have to research very quickly. You don't have months to write, to conduct research. We might have a sprint, maybe two. And I think the concern is that because academia deals with a larger time frame, that it's difficult for them. The perception is that it's difficult for people coming to academia to adapt to that quicker turnaround time. What are your thoughts on that perception?
I mean, there are true things about how research is done in academia, but I don't think that has any correlation with someone's ability to come in and learn a new process quickly. And it's important for job seekers, like in that particular situation, to know that they're going to have to do this. You can't really interview effectively unless you understand this in the first place, because you're going to get asked a hypothetical question. Let's say our team at Spotify is trying to figure out like why we can't get people to, subscribe to podcasts. Like, okay, and you have 2 months to do this project. You have to know how to answer that question. And that's how you're going to show that person who is concerned about that or wondering about that you can do that. If you're kind of flailing and you don't really know how to scope a project, even the word scope, that's not an academic word, right? That's a word that we use in UX. So all of these things are layered. Like you have to work backwards and know, like, okay, in order to go into the job and like start off on the right foot and essentially know what I'm doing, here's what I need to know. And to interview effectively, here's what I need to know. And so all of this stuff builds on top of everything else to help you be successful and to make people understand that you're qualified. There will be people out there who are just closed-minded and make assumptions, and that's just a fact as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know that I've sat in on some interviews and seen a couple different reactions to the scope and the speed of work. Some were like, whoa, that's really quick. And some were like, yeah, cool, but they didn't really sell themselves, even though they may have not worked in such a short time span. They didn't really sell themselves that they could do this. Like you just said, learn a new process, how they're adaptable. And I think that's a really good point. I appreciate you sharing that, because that is something that they could speak to if it's not black and white in their resume or in their experience, that they are adaptable. And I wish that more candidates who are interviewing would express that, because it feels like it falls a little bit flat sometimes in the interviews I have been, is that disconnect between you're used to working in months, products are used to working in sprints, which are potentially 2 weeks. How's that going to fly?
Mm-hmm. And it depends on the work. If you're going to be doing mostly evaluative work, that project scopes and the length of time you work on something, that might be different from some kind of more exploratory project where you might spend some months doing it. The other thing too is, in academia, you think of your dissertation work as a project, and it's a long-term sort of thing. There's a lot to it, but your goal is very different a lot of the time than the goals that you'll have with this other research. So this is, I think, what helps people be successful in interviewing and in making their resume. All of these interactions that people can have throughout the job search and interview process is like this foundational work that needs to be done before you even make your resume, before you start applying. That really is the key.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So I want to wrap up a little bit with talking about just your perception of the UX research field in general. Maybe ask you to get your crystal ball out and make some predictions, and see, based on what you've learned, based on what you've been through. Some might say they feel that the field is a little bit flooded. There's a lot of people coming into user experience and not as many positions. What are your thoughts on that perception?
Yes.
Yes,
I mean,
and
it's been that way for several years, and it's getting bigger. And I think that's cool. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of things driving that, right? Like, a lot of disciplines, a lot of backgrounds are applicable to this kind of work. It sounds fun and exciting, and it is in large part. People want to make a sustainable living to support themselves financially, and that tech is one of the best places to do that. And there's nothing wrong with, like, we work for money. Like, most of us work to make money. Let's just face it, right? Doesn't mean we wouldn't work if we, if things were different, but that's the reality. So I just want to say that that's okay to be driven by that. Yeah, that's the reality. And I would say, the question is, like, how can I, as a candidate, effectively navigate this reality? And I think it just goes back to what I was saying about knowing what you need to know at the beginning and setting that foundation for success. Don't just come out of school and start interviewing right away. If you're already in a role, you need to be ready to interview for roles that say might be at a higher level, right? Like, you have to do prep work to make this happen successfully. And the other part of it is being strategic. I feel like there's 3 components to effective job searches. One of them is, like networking, for example. And you want to be really strategic about who you network with and how you do it, right? How much time do you want to spend on LinkedIn? How many events do you want to go to? Is this event important for you in this moment? The self-directed learning. So, just start with some classic books of user experience to get the lay of the land, to know the language. You don't have to go read About Face by Alan Cooper, which is an awesome giant textbook.
Yeah,
it's a good one, but you don't have to read the whole thing before you apply for jobs. Just look at Just Enough Research and Interviewing Users and Usability Testing Essentials. Just pick a few things that will give you the lay of the land, help you know how to talk about your work, right? So that self-directed learning, is an important component. And then also knowing how to talk about yourself and tell your story you can't make effective materials or interview effectively until you really know how to talk about yourself. And so a strategy is a series of actions, deliberate actions that you take that all work together towards an outcome. It's just like how businesses work. Okay, we're going to put our resources into this. We're going to cancel this project. We're going to move this team over here, like whatever it may be. And it's the same thing where you really want to have a plan. You want to be iterating on your materials. You want to be paying attention to what's working and what's not, making sure you're networking, and which is community engagement, like across the whole time, right? Not just at the beginning, not, like at the whole time, and even beyond after you get your job. It's really important. And knowing what you don't know that is important to know, right? So like plan this out for yourself and see how things go. And it just accelerates the process. You're not just kind of like flailing around and doing things without being really intentional about it.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd just like to follow up that the networking is key. It's different now with COVID and remoteness. It's changed quite a bit, but I have definitely received jobs through my network.
Mhm.
I've given jobs, like not hired the person, but I left a company. I said, here is a resume of somebody I know. She would be a great replacement. And she got that job. They never even opened the job to the broader market. So your networking, your network, is key so much to your success.
Yeah, and networking isn't just like, hey, let's connect on LinkedIn.
Right.
Find people that you have affinities with, who are more likely to be interested in sharing their time with you, or like they have a similar educational background. Maybe they're a person of color, right? Like you have certain affinities with folks. So like focus on people that you have a connection with that creates like just a little bit of rapport. If you listen to a podcast and you found someone's interview or whatever to be really insightful, message them on LinkedIn and call out a couple specific things that you learned and that you appreciate. Being able to learn from them. Would love to connect with you on here. That kind of message is a genuine sort of message rather than like random connections. Events are good, like even online events. There's a lot of engagement and interaction that is facilitated by conferences, for example. That's a great way to meet people. Starting with who's in your network and seeing if they're connected to folks, right? So that is absolutely really important. And networking also is just like engaging in the community in a way that's not just like person to person in a private kind of conversation, but commenting on other people. So for example, on LinkedIn, which is just like really the best place to network, I think, for professionals. And then, Twitter can also be good. There's like a design Twitter community. But on LinkedIn, if you start to follow folks you're interested in, you engage with their posts in a genuine way that's contributing to the conversation, you might end up meeting someone through that conversation. You might post your own stuff and then people come to you, and that's the value of that algorithm and network, right, for sharing things out. So you can start to create connections in that way as well. And the idea too is like, just, how do you be top of mind for people when they come across something and they think, oh, Jen or Nicole, like this would be great for them. Let me pass along this thing. So thinking about it beyond just adding connections without substance is important.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I'll do a couple shameless plugs. This is why we added networking events to the end of UX research and strategy, because we know that these events are half learning and half meeting people. And so we added networking events to most of our events, or we have exclusive networking events for those opportunities as well. And like Slack communities are also a good place to connect with people who have like interest in in what you're interested in, right? UX research and strategy has a Slack community. There's a lot of great Slack communities out there, but
Yeah,
I'm with you.
Facebook groups.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you, Amy. I think LinkedIn is probably one of the strongest professional platforms to really start those conversations and to network with the I don't know, is it the right kind of people? In the right ways? I don't know.
You know, you get to design your own LinkedIn experience. It's customizable if you think about it. Follow the people you're interested in. You know, connect with those folks. Keep in touch with them. Post things that are of value to your community of people. You know, get rid of the noise, and I think that's an important thing. Is like for Slack, right? There's some really great groups, but imagine like keeping up with every conversation in every thread in every single channel in the 10 Slack groups that you're in. That is not a good use of your time. So how do you really get, you know, like clear on, okay, these are the channels I want to follow, and I'm going to check it once a day. And I'm just not even going to look at this stuff because it's noise. And it's the same thing with LinkedIn. Like, getting rid of noise and like using your time and energy on things that don't really support your strategy and your goal is an important factor in being strategic and following the plan that you have.
Awesome. Okay, and just a note on networking too, we do have our July event that we are hosting on Thursday, the 21st, is a networking event, and there are still tickets available. So if you want to register for that and work on your networking, that's a great place to do it. So we can provide a link for that too. And then, I mean, this has been super helpful, and you've shared so many great tips and lots of insights and advice. And so just as a last question here, any other final thoughts you have or words of advice for those that are seeking UX research roles right now?
Yeah, don't give up. Don't give up. If you get strategic about it, you're just going to see so much more success and more success happening more quickly. So I would say that's one thing, is to just focus on what you can control. Don't like obsess over the headlines. You know, things are still unfolding right now in mid 2022. I almost said 2020 because it feels like 2020. So I would say that, and really reflect on your story, what makes you distinct from other candidates. Think about your audience, think about your users, right? Who is looking at this material at this point in the process? What do they really care about and need to know about me right now? So I would say those are just a few things to keep in mind. And, you know, there's so many people in our community that are so generous with their time. There's a lot of great meetups. UXRS is a great one, of course. You know, finding mentors, you know, don't be afraid to reach out to people because you don't really have anything to lose. So yeah, I think that would be it. And thank you so much for inviting me back on here to chat about these questions. I enjoy this topic. It's something I, you know, do a lot of and talk about regularly with my clients, but happy to share this info publicly so people can incorporate it and think about it. And thank you too for being such great quality organizers. You're one of the, I mean, if not the best, at least in my, you know, viewpoint right now, meetup groups that I have come across, like the quality of your events, the quality of the hosting and the behind the scenes logistical and planning stuff. It's been amazing. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. Coming from you. That's a huge compliment. So thank you so much. And again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to revisit. We had so many questions, and I know that some people are like, she didn't answer my questions. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to do that, because you opened a lot of can of worms and had a lot of good stuff that you started talking about. And people are like, I want more. So thank you.
Worm can opener.
Well, as a researcher, that's kind of what we do sometimes, right? We open cans of worms, cause trouble. So again, Thank you so much, Amy, for this follow-up session. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.